All right. So hello everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present at LLVM Social Bangalore. Um, this is a talk on imagining a new compiler architecture, the compiler as a database of optimizations. This is joint work, done as research with my PhD advisor Alex Aiken and my PhD advisees Manjeet Dahiya, Shubhani, Abhishek Rose. All of whom are current or past PhD students at IIT Delhi. Also, there are several past masters and bachelor students who have contributed to the work I will present today. I also want to say that this is an overview talk which will touch on multiple contributions of a research group without going into any one in full detail. The purpose of this talk is to motivate the problem and share some high-level results. If you find any of the pieces of work I describe interesting, I would invite you to view dedicated videos on those pieces of work linked on my webpage, and also read our papers or try our tools. So let's start with the problem. Hardware architectures are innovating at a much faster pace. For example, many-core, SIMD, complex memory hierarchies, complex instruction set architectures, on-chip accelerators, etc. But it is much harder for compilers to keep pace. And because compilers are slow to catch up, architects are forced to reconsider their ideas. An architectural feature that the compiler does not support is basically used by a very few expert assembly programmers, and so does not make the desired impact. To understand why compilers are so slow in responding to architectural changes, it is instructive to look at the complexity growth in compilers. This chart demonstrates the number of lines of code in the GCC compiler over time. Starting from 1992, the number of lines of code has increased linearly, basically as fast as humans could develop it. Today, GCC stands at over 18 million lines of code, which is an astounding amount of complexity. To steer and adapt this complexity to the changing architectural and hardware needs is daunting. Now, at this point, I'm often asked this question that why there's a dip at around 2017 from the 16 million to, let's say, somewhere around less than 14 million. And I checked this, and basically they deprecated support for a particular garbage collector. So there's nothing very interesting going on here. The point is that we've just been increasing the complexity of GCC over time. So how does LLVM fare? Well, indeed, LLVM developers, because LLVM started later than GCC, have a distinct advantage over GCC developers by virtue of starting late, and thus leveraging modern tools and techniques and also avoiding known pitfalls. Yet the development model of the compiler hasn't changed. And we see a similar growth in for LLVM2. Here I show the lines of codes in LLVM's core components only, which basically is mostly the include directory and the lib directory in LLVM repository. In LLVM over time, starting from 2001 till today. Once again, we see a linear increase in complexity that is showing no signs of slowing down. The total lines of code on LLVM's core components stands at over 3 million lines of code. Moreover, the graphs that I have showed so far are only for a small set of languages supported by GCC and LLVM. The set of all languages that people use is much larger. The reason we have so many languages is because while some are easier to program, others are easier to optimize for performance. Also, some languages are domain specific. Moreover, the number and types of hardware substrates has been growing at breakneck speed too, from FPGAs to neuromorphic to accelerators to GPUs, etc. Once again, some are easier to program, others are easier to optimize, and yet some others are domain specific. Necessitated by the end of the Moore's law, we are witnessing an unprecedented rate of increase in the number of languages and the number of hardware architectures. This rate of increase in diversity on both ends is not just necessitated by the end of Moore's law, but also by the increasing number of computing applications being discovered over time, such as AI. A key component of this picture, which can help us tackle this complexity in an easier manner, is the compiler. However, as I said before, the progress in compiler development is too slow to meet these growing demands. So if we consider this problem of compilation as a problem solution pair, where the problem is the program specification that needs to be implemented, and the solution is an optimized assembly implementation that implements that problem specification. Then traditionally, this distance from the problem to the solution is covered by compiler algorithms that have been carefully developed by expert human programmers. Because the teams of human programmers are limited by the amount of complexity they can tackle, we are bottlenecked by the pace of compiler development, as we have also seen in the charts we saw before. So what is the solution? Well, I will only make some proposals, and I don't have, of course, I don't have a complete solution. Otherwise, I would have already changed the whole world. But I'm going to paint a potential solution picture. And one potential solution to this problem is to try and get machines to help us in this compiler development task. An overwhelmingly large fraction of the compiler complexity is its optimization logic. So if we could get the machines to automatically identify optimization opportunities, that would relieve the human programmers of this complex task and could potentially make the compiler development process faster. Here we have two sets of algorithms. One set of the algorithms are the inductive synthesis algorithms that use certain heuristics and search strategies to automatically propose candidate solutions. You can imagine that these inductive synthesis algorithms are approximate. Example, they may be based on machine learning techniques, for example. And so the candidate solutions may be incorrect. However, a compiler cannot tolerate an incorrect optimization, and so we use a validator, also called an equivalence checker, that checks every candidate solution. This is the second set of required algorithms in this design. The equivalence checker checks the candidate solution for equivalence against the program specification. If it is able to prove that the two are equivalent, we obtain an optimized solution. On the other hand, if the equivalence checker is unable to prove that the program specification and the optimized assembly implementation are equivalent, it should typically generate a counterexample. A counterexample here is just a program input that would cause the specification and the implementation to behave differently. This counterexample can then be used by the inductive synthesis algorithms to appropriately fine-tune their search so better candidates are generated in future. This vision has been painted by several researchers, and not just me, of course, in a common theme of work called program synthesis and super optimization. Unlike current compiler optimization algorithms, a super optimizer is interested in finding the optimal implementation for a given problem, and hence the name super optimization was coined by Henry Massillon in 1987. For inductive synthesis, several algorithms have been proposed, starting from brute force enumeration, stochastic search, learning from examples, mutation-based learning, algorithms based on constraint solving, neural networks, etc. In fact, you can plug any fancy technique you like here because the algorithm only needs to produce candidates, but hopefully good candidates. In that sense, these inductive synthesis algorithms are noisy and approximate, unlike the correct by construction algorithms used in current compilers. Irrespective of this noisy synthesis strategy, we would always require an equivalence checker that would act as a gatekeeper for these learned transformations. The better an equivalence checker, the more optimizations we could potentially learn. Thus, the power of a super optimizer is in a big way dependent on the capabilities of an equivalence checker. For example, if an equivalence checker incorrectly discards a valid solution, our system will never be able to identify and learn the corresponding optimization. Okay. So let's step back and compare this development model that I'm proposing to the traditional development model for a compiler. In the traditional model, an engineer gets an optimization idea. She codes it up, and then the code is reviewed by experts. Sometimes the proposal is rejected for various reasons, such as the optimization is too complex for the benefits it entails, or the optimization is too specific to a certain programming language or to a certain architecture, or because the optimization requires coordination of a lot of different compiler passes, and that would probably require a complete overhaul of the compiler, and so on. Overall, too much expert human effort has already been wasted in this exercise without making much progress. In some cases, if the engineer is lucky and the idea was indeed good, the optimization idea gets accepted after painstakingly careful reviews. But wait, even with all this careful reviewing effort, compiler bugs remain common. Most compiler bugs are caused due to overlooking of corner case situations resulting from integer overflows, memory overruns, undefined behavior assumptions made by the optimization algorithm, etc. These corner case situations are really easy to miss for human reviewers in such large code bases, but would typically not escape a mechanical validator like an equivalence checker. The proposed development model, which we have also been referring to as a super optimization model, looks much different. Here, the inductive synthesis algorithms are rather carefree in what they propose. For example, they may throw all aliasing considerations out of the window, etc. In that sense, the developers of these inductive synthesis algorithms do not need to be very sophisticated compiler experts. They are allowed to just try and see as they see fit. The onus of maintaining the correctness now lies with the equivalence checker. The equivalence checker would either reject the candidate solutions or accept them. In case it accepts the candidate solution, it caches this problem solution pair as a pattern replacement rule for future use. These pattern replacement rules can then be exposed as a table of potential peephole optimizations to the compiler. Traditionally, we think of peephole optimizations as small windows of optimization at the very end of a compiler backend. But here I'm proposing peephole optimizations as a more central way of the compiler development model. Here is an example of a pattern replacement rule or a peephole optimization that appeared in Henry Massillon's original super optimization paper titled A Look at the Smallest Program in 1987. Here the pattern is the code for the signum function in C-like syntax on the left. And the replacement is the corresponding optimized implementation for the Motorola 68020 processor. Notice that the assembly implementation does not contain any branches and would typically be hard for a human-coded compiler to generate. However, such implementations are easier to generate for a super optimizer. In my PhD work with my advisor, we generalized this approach to more permissive pattern replacement rules. For example, the pattern replacement rules could have memory accesses, like the ones shown here in the first rule. Importantly, this work was targeted towards development of peephole optimizers for x86 assembly code, and thus is slightly different from our original proposal, where I mentioned that the program specification can be in a higher level language like C. Regardless, in this work, the super optimization techniques was geared towards the automatic generation of peephole optimization and not just full solutions as done in the original Massillon paper. Here you will see other examples of peephole optimizations such as this one, and notice that one component of the pattern is also the registers that are live in the executable. So for example, if only registers R1 and R3 are live, and you see this sequence of 3 move instructions, it's okay to replace it with this exchange instruction on x86. These kind of transformations are learned automatically by a brute force enumeration based super optimizer in this work. Future work has extended these ideas to use more fancier search techniques such as stochastic search and search based on neural networks, etc. Here are some more pattern replacement rules that were discovered by the super optimizer automatically. Here we see rules that involve the use of relatively new architectural features at that time, such as vector instructions and conditional moves. Notice that these pattern replacement rules also take into account the liveness information of assembly registers. Further, this work proposed the generalization of problem solution pairs to pattern replacement rules with symbolic constants. For example, C0 and C1 are symbolic constants. In this table, we see 2 pattern replacement rules, both implementing local constant propagation. C0 and C1 in these patterns could match with arbitrary constants, say 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6, in the assembly code being optimized. The algorithm was capable of generalizing the problem solution pairs to pattern replacement rules with such symbolic constants automatically. Because only acyclic patterns and replacements were considered in this work, The equivalence checker was realized by first converting assembly sequences into their logical circuits containing Boolean operators, and then using a satisfiability solver to decide equivalence. The result of the satisfiability solver is either true, which means the programs are equivalent, or false, in which case a counterexample is generated by the satisfiability solver that demonstrates the inequivalence. But this work on automatic generation of people optimization is nowhere near enough for our proposed goal of replacing a human developed compiler with a super optimizer based compiler. For example, one of the big limitations of a pattern replacement rule is that it cannot reason about loops. This is an important limitation because loop transformations are the most consequential optimizations for runtime, as any compiler developer would know. Further, aliasing information is not captured in these rules. For example, if a pattern has two memory accesses, one to a stack and another to a heap location, there is no way for the pattern to encode the fact that the two do not alias. And so this kind of a people transformation will not be automatically generated by the super optimizer because the equivalence checker would deem them inequivalent because it cannot reason about the non-aliasing of the stack address and the heap address. There are several problems to be solved to potentially realize a super optimizer based architecture for a compiler. In fact, I'm not even sure that it is actually a practical model or not, and that's why it makes for good research, right? I mean, if we were 100% sure that it's a good idea, then it won't be called research, I guess. But perhaps one of the most important problems here is the development of an equivalence checker that is capable of supporting loops and aliasing information, and that is what we focus on in our research. Recall that we said that the capabilities of the equivalence checker determine the power of the super optimizer based compiler development approach. The equivalence checker needs to support checks for end-to-end equivalence for unoptimized program specification and a fully optimized implementation without assuming any knowledge of the intermediate steps used in the transformation pipeline. It needs to support loops, aliasing information, and all the general constructs of an imperative programming language such as function calls. Importantly, the equivalence checker must have no false positives. In other words, it must return true only for truly equivalent programs. In other words, the equivalence checker must be sound. A false negative is a situation where an equivalence checker returns false when the programs were actually equivalent. It is perhaps not possible to build an equivalence checker that is both sound and has zero false negatives, because the problem is undecidable in general in Turing's model of computation with an infinite tape. The equivalence checker thus should aim to minimize such false negatives. So while we cannot tolerate any false positives, false negatives are unavoidable, but we should try to minimize them. That's basically the goal of the equivalence checker. This problem of equivalence checking has a well-known and important application in what is called translation validation. Because compilers are so complex and thus they have bugs, a translation validator checks the source code against the machine code for equivalence for a given compilation. Because this is a well understood experimental setting, we have been developing and testing our equivalence checker in this context too. Translation validation remains an open problem, and the development of an equivalence checker that performs automatic translation validation would be a significant step forward in the development of provably correct compilers. Our research over the past 8+ years has targeted this space, even though our broader motivations relate to a super optimization based compiler. Consider the C program shown in red and assembly program shown in C-like syntax in blue, left and right. The left is C and the right is abstracted assembly in C-like syntax. The C program on the left uses a variable I to access arrays A and B. The assembly program on the right uses register R1 to access arrays A and B. Given equal input arguments and memory states at program entry, equivalence checking involves proving equal return value and equal memory states at the exit. The question is how to show this through a proof. The proof will basically try to identify a lockstep execution of the two programs such that whenever one program executes one step, the other program executes the corresponding step. These correlated locksteps in the two programs need to be identified such that it remains possible to relate the two machine states at all times, including the time when the two programs exit. For example, in this pair of programs, one iteration of the C program may be correlated in lockstep execution with one iteration of the assembly program. When I say one iteration of the assembly program, I mean one iteration of the assembly program's loop, and similarly the C program's loop. Before we discuss equivalence checking, it is helpful to represent the program as a control flow graph or CFG. A CFG node represents a program PC location and each edge represents a transition. For example, the C2 node in the CFG represents the C2 PC in the C program. A transition from C2 to C3 is represented as an edge in the CFG and represents the instruction at C2, which is this AI equals BI by 2 and I++. It's a mega instruction formed by the two statements in a single edge. Unlike the conventional representation of a CFG where nodes are instructions and edges represent control flow, this is a slightly different representation of a CFG where nodes are PCs and edges represent instructions. The edge is labeled with a transfer function of the corresponding instruction that determines the new state at the destination of the edge as a function of the machine state at the source of the edge. For example, when the edge from C2 to C3 is taken, the corresponding transfer function specifies that AI is updated with the value BI by 2 and I is incremented by 1. Also, every edge is labeled with a condition under which that edge is taken, also called its edge condition. For example, the edge from C3 to C2 is taken if the current value of I is less than 1024. Given two CFGs for a pair of programs, we are interested in identifying a lockstep execution that shows that the two programs are equivalent. We will identify this lockstep execution automatically through the incremental construction of what we call a product program. A product program is a product of two programs. In this case, the C program and the assembly program. A product program is a program that executes both programs in lockstep. For example, the product program may execute one iteration of the C program followed by one iteration of the assembly program. The product program correlates the transitions in one program with the transitions in another program as though they execute correspondingly in lockstep. For instance, the transition from C0 to C2 needs to be correlated with some edges of the assembly program. And we don't yet know which edges they should be. Let's say our algorithm is automatically able to identify that it is the A0 to A2 edge that should be correlated with C0 to C2. And then this can be encoded as a part of the product program. To represent the product program, we use a control flow graph that represents this lockstep execution. The entry node of this product program's control flow graph, also called the product CFG, is this node called C0, A0, which represents the condition that the first program is at PC C0 and the second program is at PC A0. We call this control flow graph on the right the product CFG. Further, edges are added to the product CFG that encode the correlations. For example, here we want to have a correlation for the edge C0 to C2. However, we have not yet correlated this edge of the C program with an edge of the assembly program yet. For example, we do not know which PC to correlate with C2. Should it be A2, A3 or something else? Let's say our algorithm is able to figure this out automatically, and it figures this out and says that the correlation of C0 to C2 is with A0 to A2 in the assembly program. So the C program's edge is shown in red while the assembly program's edge is shown in blue. In general, it is hard to determine which path in the C program to correlate with which path in the assembly program in lockstep. And that was one of our contributions in our research algorithm to do this automatically. Even after we do these correlations in the product, we need to find the relations between the machine states of the two programs. After all, equivalence is all about the equivalence of return values and heap states at the exit of the programs. So we need to be able to reason about the machine states of the two programs and what are their relations. To be able to reason about equivalence, we can assume that the inputs, at least, of the two programs are equivalent, and then we have to show that all the outputs are equivalent, for example. In general, we have to show that all the observable behaviors are equivalent. In this case, the observable behaviors are only the outputs that are returned by these two programs. So at the input, we can assume that the arguments to the two programs are equal, if any. and the heap states of the two programs are identical. As we construct the product CFG correlations, we can also infer the invariants at the intermediate nodes. For example, in the current product CFG, we can be sure that whenever control reaches C2A2 through the lockstep execution of both programs, the variable I in the first program and the variable R1 in the second program would both have the value 0, because that's the only possibility at this point. In addition to I and R1, we can also infer that because the heap states were identical at C0, A0, they will remain identical at C2, A2 in the product program. These relations between variables of the two programs are also called the invariants in the product program. An invariant on the product CFG node is a predicate that will always hold whenever the execution of the product program reaches that point. And indeed, whenever the product program reaches C2, A2, these conditions will always hold in the product CFG that we have constructed so far. The algorithm then proceeds by correlating the loop transitions. For example, one iteration of the C loop body is correlated with one iteration of the assembly loop body. We haven't yet discussed how we were going to figure out these correlations, but let's say the algorithm is able to figure this out. After it figures these correlations out, it adds these correlated edges to the product CFG, shown in red and blue edges again. And the red edges is basically the C program's transition from C2 to itself, and the blue edge is the assembly program transition from A2 to itself. And the product program encodes this lockstep execution that whenever C2 executes whenever the C program executes from C2 to C2 for one iteration, the assembly program also executes one iteration, and that's the exact lockstep that the product program is encoding. Notice that it is now no longer true that I equals 0 and R1 equals 0 are invariants at C2, A2, because now, because of the loop in edges, I could have incremented in C, and similarly R1 could have incremented in A, and so these are no longer invariants. On the other hand, heap equalities are still invariants. What are the new invariants that we can infer about I and R1 at C2, A2? It turns out that because these two loop bodies have been correlated in lockstep, whenever I is incremented by 1, R1 is also incremented by 1. And so we can infer that the invariant here is not I equals 0 and R1 equals 0, but we can infer a weaker invariant, which is I equals R1. Here, notice that irrespective of what path the product program takes, for example, it just comes from C0, A0 to C2, A2, or it goes through the loops 10 times, we'll always have this invariant that I equals R1 because the two programs will always execute in lockstep. Finally, the product program encodes the fact that whenever the C program exits, this assembly program exits also, and vice versa. This is encoded by these correlations between C2 and these edges from C2 to EC and A2 to EA. The given program pair. So how do we know that the given program pair are equivalent? How does the construction of the product CFG help us determining equivalence? Based on this product CFG, we can determine whether the programs are equivalent or not by checking if the inferred invariants are strong enough to prove equivalent return values and heap states at program exit. In this case, this equivalence can indeed be proven through the product CFG we have constructed. Okay, because in one case we are returning I, in the other case we are returning R1, and we already know that I equals R1, so we know that the return values are equivalent. Similarly, we know that the heap states are identical at program exit, and so this product CFG serves as a proof of equivalence. In the translation validation setting, the equivalence checker must be sound. That is, if the equivalence checker determines the programs to be equivalent, then the programs must be guaranteed to have equivalent runtime behavior for all possible inputs. We have also called this property the property of zero false positives previously. On the other hand, the problem of identifying the correlated transitions automatically and the required invariants for the complex compiler transformations is hard and is actually undecidable in general in Turing's model of computation with an infinite tape. And so completeness may not always be achievable. In other words, there will always be some false negatives where we may not be able to find a proof even if programs are actually equivalent. Our research aims to reason about equivalence in scenarios where previous algorithms fail to compute equivalence in order to result in a more robust equivalence checker. Recall that a more robust equivalence checker results in a more powerful translation validator and a more powerful super optimizer. So that is the problem we have been attacking in our research. In our example, our algorithm should automatically identify which program paths in the C program are correlated with which program paths in the assembly program. Moreover, to achieve robustness, multiple path pairs with different possible transitions must be enumerated. For example, when we consider candidate correlations for the loop edge from A2 to A3 to A2, either we could correlate one iteration of the C program, C2 to C3 to C2 with this A2, A3, A2, or two iterations of this C program, let's say C2, C3, C2, C3, C2 with one iteration of A2, A3, A2, or maybe 1.5 iterations of the C program, let's say C0, C2, C3, C2, C3, C2, C3, and that's it with A2, A3, A2. So all these are possibilities. And to get robustness, we must consider all these possibilities, because how do we know what the compiler has done? And we don't want to make any assumptions of what the compiler has actually done. We want to try all possibilities. And that's what I mean by robustness. And the algorithm needs to intelligently pick one of these candidates, which should be the right candidate, hopefully. It's not just about the correlation algorithm. It's also about the relations that we get between the two machine states when we do lockstep execution. So for example, we saw in our example that one of the relations that we got was that I equals R1. But how do we know that that is the relation that we need? There are many possibilities for the relation. For example, I equals R1 into 100, or R1 plus 5 equals I, or there are like huge number of possibilities. So how do we figure this out automatically and in a scalable way? A previous algorithm would use guess and check strategy. So guess and check strategy would first enumerate all the possibilities, and of course it won't be able to enumerate all the possibilities because the number of possibilities is huge. So it will restrict the set to some smaller number of common types of possibilities, and then it will check each of those possibilities. For example, it will check, can I prove that R1 equals I at C2A2? And then it will make a satisfiability formula out of it and give it to a theorem prover, which is also called an SMT solver, with a higher order theory of bit vectors and arrays and other things. And then the SMT solver will either say, yes, this is actually provable, or it will say, no, this is not provable, and here's a counterexample. However, doing this for every possible guess and for a huge number of guesses is obviously intractable. Here is another example. So for example, the kind of query that I give to the SMT solver would be, if I equals R1, then if I execute this edge, then can I show that at C2, I2, A2, R1 plus 5 equals I? Now, considering the fact that I has been incremented by 1 and R1 has been incremented by 1, R1 plus 5 equals I becomes R1 plus 6, because R1 has become R1 plus 1. So R1 plus 6 equals I plus 1, because I also has been incremented 1. And so we give this query to the SMT solver. If I equals R1, can we show that I plus 1 equals R1 plus 6? And the answer is no, and the SMT solver says no. And it also returns a model or a valuation of I and R1, which shows that this formula is false. So for example, if we substitute I equals 100 and R1 equals 100, then we would see that this formula would evaluate to false. This model is also called a counterexample. Please remember this fact that the SMT solver generates a counterexample, because we're going to use this counterexample in our algorithm to automatically determine these relations, required relations for equivalence checking, and also to identify the correlations that I've been discussing between parts of the two programs. So here are our research contributions. The first key idea is a counterexample guided invariant inference procedure. As I said, previous algorithms would use a guess and check strategy, which is not scalable, but a counterexample guided invariant inference strategy is more scalable. So for example, let's say the required invariant at C2, A2 was 2 into I equals R1. Now notice that this is different from the original example that I used. I just made the example slightly more interesting by changing I equals R1 to 2 into I equals R1. And this was the actual invariant that actually holds in the product program. How do we figure this out among all the other possibilities, like I plus 5 equals R1 or whatever it is? And how do we do this without having to go through all the possibilities? We are going to use counterexamples. So for example, we have been able to figure out these counterexamples basically allow us to figure out what are the possible machine states that can appear at different nodes. So example, we can already figure out that at C2, A2, I equals 0 and R1 equals 0 can appear. Then we can execute this counterexample, which is I equals 0 and R1 equals 0 on this path, and we'll get I equals 1 because I has been incremented by 1, and R1 equals 2 because R1 has been incremented by 2. And so now we'll get a value pair which is 1, 2. And so, these are all the possibilities, and these are too much to do automatically. And so we're going to use execution output, as I was just discussing. And so the possibilities that we get are I equals 0 and R1 equals 0 is one possibility, or I equals 1 and R1 equals 2 is another possibility. We can kind of execute more, and we'll find that I equals 2 and R1 equals 4 is another possibility, and so on. And so we can collect a bunch of these possibilities on our concrete states that were found using counterexamples. And from these states, like the ones shown in the blocks on the left, we can identify some affine relations. You know, there are standard techniques to use, which are called bit vector affine algebra solvers, that can take these points as input and draw a line through them to basically give you a potential invariant. In this case, with these 3 points, we would get a potential invariant, which is 2 into I equals R1. This counterexample guided invariant inference is much faster than the guess and check strategy that I described earlier, which would have to go through all the possible guesses one by one. Here we are able to very quickly converge to the actual invariant. This work was published at SAT 2018 with this paper title, and I invite you to read it. Our second contribution here is a counterexample guided correlation algorithm. During the incremental construction of product CFG, we have seen this picture where we need to pick one correlation out of all the possible correlations to expand further. For example, A2 to A2 could be correlated with one iteration of the loop of C function, or 2 iterations, and so on. We basically propose a counterexample guided correlation algorithm, which involves executing the concrete mappings on all possible correlations, and then inferring the strongest possible relations using the execution output, using the invariant inference algorithm that I just described. So we are going to, use the counterexamples and execute in all these different product programs. Notice that each of these 3 options represent 3 different product programs. And so we're going to, identify invariants at C2, A2 using our invariant inference strategy that I just described earlier, using the counterexamples for all the 3 product CFGs. And let's say the invariants that we get for the first product CFG is sum equals R2 for some variables sum and R2 in the 2 programs. In the second one, we get sum equals R2 and I equals R3. And let's say in the third one, we get sum equals R3. These invariants have been inferred using counterexamples using the algorithm that I just described. Now, looking at these invariants, we will say that one correlation is more promising than the other. For example, in these 3 choices, the middle one seems the most promising because it maintains the most amount of correlation between the 2 programs. The program states are most correlated here. There's a tighter coupling because we don't only have a relation for sum, we also have a relation for another variable called I. And so this looks more promising than the other options. So this is basically the intuition of our counterexample guided correlation algorithm. And so this one, the middle one, will be ranked higher. I'm going to show this with another example later. This work has appeared in OOPSLA 2020 and titled Counterexample Guided Correlation Algorithm for Translation Validation, and we also call it the counter algorithm. Let's look at the functioning of the counter algorithm on a more interesting example than the kind of examples that we've been seeing so far. Consider this example program on the left. Here, there is a single loop that iterates I from 0 to len. Also, we have mid equals len by 2. The body of the loop does something different when I is less than mid, and something else when I is greater than equal to mid. An optimizing compiler typically splits the loop into 2 loops as shown on the right. The first loop iterates from 0 to mid, and the second loop iterates from mid to len. The bodies of the 2 loops are identical to the body of the original loop. This transformation is commonly known as the loop splitting transformation. The compiler further transforms both loops using the loop unswitching transformation. Notice that the first loop, the second statement is never executed because I is never greater than equal to mid in the first loop now. Similarly, in the second loop, the first statement is never executed. And so using that, we can transform the two loops and remove the if conditions completely, and we get these two simplified loops. This transformation is called loop unswitching. The next transformation of a vectorizing compiler involves unrolling the second loop because it has a nice pattern where consecutive elements in memory are accessed in a sequence of iterations. Finally, the unrolled loop body of the second loop is implemented. And so here I show the unrolling. And finally, this unrolled loop body is implemented using a single vector operation in the assembly code. I'm showing a single vector XMM SSE 4.2 instruction using this extracted C-like syntax. Also, in the assembly syntax, we have several types of register allocation and other transformations that I have not explicitly mentioned here. Now, there are many transformations that have occurred so far, including vectorization, unrolling, unswitching, splitting. But what is seen by the equivalence checker is an end-to-end equivalence check. That's what I meant by end-to-end. So the original program is just the program that the programmer had written, and the final program is the very end of the assembly code that gets generated by the compiler. So our equivalence checker works for this pair of examples, and the corresponding product program that it generates is shown at the bottom. The entry node of the product CFG is C0, A0, which is basically the entry of both the programs. And then it correlates C0 to C3 with A0 to A2. Then it has a node called C3, A2. So this program is at C3 and that program is at A2. Recall that the product program encodes the lockstep execution. So this product CFG is basically encoding what is that lockstep. So if the first program executes C3, C4, C3, the second program under some conditions would just also do A2, A4, A2, which means one loop iteration of the first loop of the C loop is equal to the one loop iteration of the second loop. But under some other condition, if the C program goes from C3 to C4 to C3, the assembly program actually exits the first loop and goes to the loop head of the second loop, which is A2 to A6. And that's exactly what is being captured by that was done by the loop splitting optimization. And our equivalence checker is automatically able to figure this out and figure this lockstep correlation required to prove equivalence. Once again, we have another node, which is C3, A6, and it has a correlation for this between A6 to A6, which is one iteration of the assembly loop body, with 4 iterations of the C loop body, which is C3 to C4, C5, C3. And this time we raise it to the power of 4, which basically indicates 4 unrollings or a concatenation of 4 of this particular program path in C. Notice that this is pretty complex to do automatically. In one case, we have C4, in the other case, we have C5, but our algorithm is able to do this automatically and in a scalable way. And if the the product program also says that the assembly program goes from A6 to exit, then the C program executes 4 iterations of the loop and then exits. So once again, what's going on in the C program is different from what's going on in the assembly program, and the product CFG encodes this for us. Now, how is our algorithm able to figure out this product CFG? The first key idea here is that we're going to incrementally construct the product CFG. I'm going to show what this incremental construction of product CFG means. So basically, for example, we'll start with the single node C0, A0, and then we'll try to figure out what could be a potential correlation for A0 to A2, for example. And so maybe we'll find that, oh, for A0 to A2, it should be C0, C3. How do I figure this out? I'm going to use some counterexample guided techniques, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later about this. But let's say we are able to figure this out. Then from that, we'll be able to say, OK, then we are going to add a node C3, A2, and then we're going to infer invariants at C3, A2 using our counterexample guided invariant inference techniques. Now, using that, we are going to infer the invariants, and then we are going to now infer the correlation for A2 to A2. And this time we're going to say, oh, it's actually should be correlated with C3, C4, C3. Once again, how do we figure this out? Well, it's a combination of the invariants that we have inferred and the counterexample that we get from those invariant inference. I'm going to give some more intuition about this. It's very hard to explain this, just in a small talk, but it's basically something related to counterexample guided invariant inference and counterexample guided correlation inference. Then once again, if it goes from A2 to A6, then it's correlated with C3 to C4, C3. One iteration of the loop C body is correlated with the exit of the loop in the first loop and going to the second loop head. Then once again, we infer invariants at C3, A6. identify the correlation from A6 to A6, and the algorithm is automatically able to figure out that this time I need to correlate 4 unrollings of the C program and not just one, like in the previous one, automatically, once again using counterexample guided techniques. And finally, it figures out that when A6 goes to EA, then the corresponding thing that should happen in C is that C basically executes 4 iterations of loop body and then exits. And finally, we check equivalence of return values under the inferred invariance. So notice that we have been inferring the invariance at all these intermediate nodes all along in the product CFG. And now we are ready to check whether the equivalent, we can prove the equivalence of return values under the inferred invariance. And this is what I mean by incremental construction of the product CFG. So, obviously much of what I showed seems like a little bit of magic because I haven't explained what it is, but because I just said that, the algorithm is automatically able to figure out that for A0 to A2, this is the required correlation. I'm going to go into more detail of how this automatic inference works. So at every step of this incremental construction algorithm, we have multiple options. For example, at this step, we want to correlate the edge A0 to A2. So one option is correlate with C0, C2, C5. Another option may be, let's correlate with C0, C2, C5, C7. And so on. And we basically enumerate all these options. So this is the fan out of our search space at every step of this incremental construction. So example, here is another possibility and so on. And at each step, we are going to figure out which one is the most promising and select that and continue from there. So let's say I selected the bottom one as the most promising, and then I select that and I'm going to continue from there. And this is going to, the search tree grows. As you can see, this is an exponential search space, and an exhaustive search would take millions of years to compute, not just years, but millions of years to compute. The key here is that, with a huge probability, we make the right guess at every step. And that's what we do with our counterexample guided algorithm. Okay, so prior data on data-driven correlation would fail to construct the required product CFG for the example that I just showed in the previous slides, but our algorithm is able to do this. So how do we do this? During invariant inference, we make potential guesses for invariance, and we try to prove a guess using an SMT solver, just like I showed you before. If the guess is provable, we have found an invariant. If not, the SMT solver returns a counterexample. These counterexamples basically represent machine states that could potentially occur at this node in the product CFG. The concrete state would involve valuations of related variables of both C and A. And using this, we are going to basically say, what is the behavior of this, this machine state on the product CFG on these different possibilities? And we are going to prune out obviously incorrect possibilities. And this is called counterexample guided pruning. So for some of these possibilities of product CFGs, these generated counterexamples would show that this is not even possible because it doesn't have correlations for some important state elements of the program. And so we're going to prune them out. And this is called counterexample guided pruning. And then we are going to rank some possibilities higher than others, just like I showed you earlier, which was, if one possibility is correlating more variables, then that is ranked higher than the others. So in this way, we implement a counterexample guided best first search. So in the worst case, our algorithm still remains exponential, but in the common case, our algorithm is linear time and actually is very good at figuring out correlation proofs for the typical types of transformations that compilers perform, even for complex transformation pipelines like the one that I showed in the example I used. So once again, how does this work? Here are the two possibilities for product CFG. Let's say the first possibility is shown here and the second possibility is shown here. In both these possibilities, we'll infer the invariants, and depending on what invariants we infer, we are going to, let's say in one of them, the invariants are this, like correlating 3 variables. In the second product CFG, the invariants are this, which is just correlating 2 variables. Then we are going to rank one of them higher. The one that has correlating more number of variables is going to be ranked higher. So we rank based on the number of live assembly values correlated through the inferred invariance. And so this is ranked higher, and this works very well in practice. And this, without backtracking, it's able to solve the problem that I showed you, the example that I showed you earlier, which involved loop splitting and loop unswitching. So for evaluating this algorithm, the counter algorithm, we basically did experiments where we used unoptimized LLVM IR and optimized x86 assembly code generated through 3 different compilers. Notice that because we don't care about what the transformations were, it's an end-to-end equivalence checker. We don't really care about which, we're not tied to a particular compiler. So we tried 3 different compilers: GCC, Clang LLVM, and Intel C compiler, ICC. And we used our equivalence checker based on the counter algorithm. And we evaluated on the test suite for vectorizing compilers, which represents the most challenging benchmarks for this kind of work. And we were able to find for large majority of these benchmarks, almost 90% plus, we were able to automatically identify the proofs. This is a huge improvement over any previous work on equivalence checking. Through these efforts, we have also discovered bugs in compilers over the years. Most of these bugs were discovered by happenstance, where we were just actually debugging our own equivalence checker, typically expecting to find bugs in our equivalence checker, but sometimes we would find bugs in the software or in the compiler. For example, we have found bugs in ICC, GCC, the QEMU machine emulator. Sometimes we have done equivalence checks between 2 different library implementations of the same glibc function, and we found bugs in some of the library implementations. And sometimes we even found bugs in the SMT solver because while we were debugging our work. All these bugs were found by a team of 2 to 3 people only, and we think like more it just shows that the tool is actually pretty powerful if it's applied at scale. If you want to know more about these bugs, their details are available at this URL, compiler.ai/bugs. Now I'll talk about another related piece of work on our group, which is based on black box equivalence checking that I just described, which is called automatic generation of debug headers. Consider this program that reads a value from array yi, adds val to it, and writes to a location in xi, and does it in a loop which goes from I equals 0 to I is less than len. Now, when I compile this using LLVM with O3 optimization and then execute it within a GDB session, a debugging session, and let's say I add a breakpoint at this PCC2 and I run and I try to print the value of I get 0 in the first time I hit this breakpoint at C2. But then if I do continue, then even after many iterations, I still keep getting 0, which is a wrong debugging information that is generated by LLVM. This is a very common problem. And the problem is that the compilers are not preserving the debug information and are often giving you the wrong debugging information, and the GDB is showing you the wrong information. And this becomes a real pain for developers during debugging sessions. The problem is, of course, not limited to LLVM. Here's an example session for the same program on GCC. And this time, instead of giving a wrong value, which is always 0, it just conveniently says that the value has been optimized out. Now, this is a big pain during development. And if you're a developer, you must have experienced this yourself. Why is this problem occurring? Well, the answer lies in, again, the complexity of the compiler. The source code, the number of lines of code in the compiler is so huge, and the complexity is so astounding that compiler developers do not prioritize the preservation of debugging information. They leave it to the end, and typically that gets ignored. And this problem is not improving with time because the complexity of compilers is only becoming more and more. So the debugging headers remain incomplete. In an executable, these relations between source code variables and the assembly registers is debug headers. And the onus of maintaining these debug headers through cross optimizations rests with the compiler developer. However, in the presence of aggressive optimization, developers find it too hard to maintain this debugging information. In this example, for example, the compiler should maintain the information that whenever the assembly program is at A4, the source program, it basically represents that the source program is at C3. Similarly, if the programmer wants to query the value I, then the debugging header should say that, oh, you should just show the value of R1 to basically tell, indicate the value of I or something like that. Or maybe R1 divided by 4 because R1 is getting incremented by 4 here and I is getting incremented by 1 here. So R1, so basically this information has to be preserved and kind of emitted by the compiler, but compilers are not doing this. And this is a big problem. So we proposed an automatic generation of debug headers based on our equivalence checker. The idea is that we have an equivalence checker that basically checks whether the source code and the machine code are equivalent with the algorithm that I just showed, the counter algorithm. And if it says yes, then we basically get a proof which includes the product CFG, that includes all the correlations and the invariants that we are now well familiar with. Using these correlations and invariants, we use linear algebra techniques to convert these invariants inferred by the equivalence checker into information that identifies the representation of a source variable in terms of the assembly registers and memory locations at every program point. Further, the algorithm employs data flow analyses on the assembly code to spread this debugging information to as many assembly PCs as possible. And finally, the debugging headers in the executables are updated using this automatically generated information. Notice that in this scheme, no manual effort was required to maintain the debugging information. Instead, a combination of automatic equivalence checking, linear algebra, and data flow analysis algorithms were used to automatically infer the debugging information. We applied the automatic algorithm to a set of programs used in the test suite of vectorizing compilers. These programs involve aggressive vectorizing transformations, and current compilers are particularly bad at maintaining the debugging information under such aggressive transformations. Indeed, our automatic algorithm is able to produce significant improvements in these cases. The improvements are as high as 73% for executables generated through Clang LLVM with O3, 75% for executables generated through GCC, and 12% for executables generated through the Intel C compilers. It is these percentage improvements represent the percentage of PC variable pairs that were added extra, which were either earlier missing or incorrect by our tool. Notice that Intel C compiler fared the best among all the three compilers, and that's because it actually had the most amount of debugging information already present, and so the space for improvement was smaller. And so we only improved it by 12%, but the space for improvement was much larger for the other compilers, Clang and GCC, where the space for improvement was almost 3x, improved by 75%. This work has been accepted at CGO 2022, and it's going to appear in the upcoming CGO conference. I invite you to listen to our talk, which will be posted soon, and also read our paper. To conclude, compiler development is hard, as you all must know, but it is increasingly important, which also all of you must already know. But I'm proposing a different solution. I'm saying, maybe super optimization is a plausible solution. If it is a plausible solution, equivalence checking is an important prerequisite, and that's what we have been spending all our effort in for now. And our current work has already shown that scalable algorithms for equivalence checking are possible, and we are extending it even further. It's not finished work, but we are very hopeful that we'll be able to bring this to a very good form, a very usable form. And we've also shown that equivalence checking has many other applications, including translation validation and automatic generation of automatic generation of debug headers. We have been, based on our work on equivalence checking, we have also been talking to potential teams such as those found in defense and aerospace industries, which deal with mission critical software, which require strong guarantees for correctness of software, including the correctness of a compiler that was used to compile the software. You can imagine that even a small bug in airborne software can cause catastrophic consequences. So we are doing a start. We have been, we have recently incubated a startup company called Compiler AI Labs. You can check out more at this webpage. We'll be updating more information very soon here, where we have been basically developing tools for doing translation validation and in general software verification for such mission teams that develop mission critical software. We are also looking, to recruit and hire in our startup. So please reach out to us if you find us interesting, and we would be very happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you, and I look forward to discussion and questions.
So I have two questions. Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So first question is that compilers tend to massage the CFG quite aggressively. So it would happen that the C node, like the node corresponding in C and A would be different. So it could be that one node in C would correspond to say 2-3 nodes in A. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in this example, you will see that one node in C, which is C3, is correlated with two nodes in A, which is A2 and A6, right? And the way we do it is, so yeah, this is a very good question. So we do support this kind of thing in our algorithm. It basically means that when we basically enumerate the possibilities, we allow many-to-one mappings between PCs in C program and the PCs in the assembly program. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah, a bit. I think I'll have to read your papers to get a better idea.
Basically, you're absolutely right in pointing out that there could be a many-to-one mapping, or I should more precisely one-to-many mapping from C nodes, C PCs to assembly PCs, and it's very important to support that kind of thing, especially for vectorizing transformations. And we do support it. And what does it mean for the algorithm? It basically means that when we enumerate the possibilities for correlation, we basically, just enumerate such possibilities also. We kind of take into account all the one-to-many possibilities. I will also point out a limitation of our algorithm. So while we can do one-to-many correlations between C and assembly, we do not do many-to-one because that becomes more complex. So, for example, while we can do loop unrolling, while we can do loop splitting, we cannot do loop merging. We cannot do loop re-rolling. So we won't be able to compute equivalence across loop re-rolling. We won't be able to compute equivalence across loop merging. But those happen to be relatively rare optimizations because those are mostly code size optimizations, not runtime optimizations. But we definitely need to support one-to-many, and we do support them. Yes.
Okay. So I have another question. So the second question is, yeah. So how does your approach compare to, like, if you were to contrast it? One thing would be that we take a CFG, like, how do I put it? So we have a CFG in a high level IR, say some C specific intermediate representation, or let us say even LLVM IR. And then we want to compare equivalence to, like, this is kind of general to super optimization. So now let me reframe my question. I think I'm glitching a bit. So now, how is super optimization for each basic block level? Would it, so rather than if I have a CFG and I do super optimization for each basic block, how does it compare to doing super optimization globally?
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously, when you do super optimization globally, you have a bigger search space, and that means you also have bigger transformation space and better potential optimization, right? Versus if you do super optimization at small basic block levels or small instruction levels and things like that, right?
Yeah, but at bigger case, we'll not be able to reason about loops anyways.
No, so that's what we want to change, right? So in the past, super optimization has been thought of as this kind of thing that will generate small people optimizations for you, like the work done by Massillin or the later work after that and so on. But we are saying that, look, I mean, okay, is there a possibility that super optimizer can also tackle loops? And for that, there are two components. One is how do we kind of automatically generate these mutations? And I'm kind of, punting on that question. I have not addressed that question. I'm saying, okay, maybe there's some machine learning approach, or maybe there's some neural network approach, or maybe there's just an exhaustive enumeration approach. Let's leave that aside. I mean, that seems like, one part of the problem. The other part of the problem, which is equally important, if not more, is, for whatever candidate is generated, how do I check equivalence? And so that's what we have been focusing on so far. And if we are able to get success, already we have, we have body of work on equivalence checking, we are able to kind of bring this all the way to full practical usability level, then, we can go back and kind of look at inductive synthesis algorithms to say, okay, now what can we do here so that this becomes possible to do across loops and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, of course, I mean, nobody has done it so far. So I'm just kind of, speculating, but or kind of painting a picture. But I think that's, I'm in my personal research, I kind of I'm betting on that.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think it is already a huge improvement over the things I've seen before, especially that lockstep algorithms. So the question I had was, I see this problem as like at least a superset of graph isomorphism. We have some graph isomorphism, but there's like other problems like heap. Like heap will complexify more. So if you have to put this problem in a complexity space, like is it? So I just read Wikipedia that graph isomorphism is not proven to be NP complete, but when you add it is not polynomial either, and it is not NP complete. That's what they say. I'm not 100% sure. But if you put this program equivalence in perspective, what would be the complexity space here?
Oh, so see, graph isomorphism is a simplified version of the problem because there's just interesting in correlations. Here we are interested in both correlations and invariants, right? I mean, that makes the problem significantly harder. And in fact, I mean, so, as I said, like in the Turing model of computation, which assumes an infinite tape, equivalence is actually an undecidable problem. So much, so like forget about polynomial, etc. It's not decidable, right? So that's where this problem is positioned, really. I mean, we don't talk about polynomial versus this, but of course, I mean, in finite settings, it's we basically it's you can call it NP hard, where the exponentiation is on the number of bits in the state, which is, by the way, huge because the state space here is 2 to the power 64, because that's the space of the possible memory states here, and that's just so astoundingly large that it's best to basically use the Turing's model and say, oh, this is an undecidable problem, and let's leave it at that, because even a polynomial algorithm on 2 to the power 64 is not meaningful, right? So
yeah. So when we do the pruning part, right, like we do a best estimate, and let's say we in one of your slides you're saying that you take the most restrictive, like which has more constraints,
right?
But when we take more constraint, it is following the some form of like greedy approach, so chances of failure also higher in later stages, right? Because you have taken more constraint in the to start with. Right? But if you take the less restrictive, you'll find more matches, I guess.
See, when we have more constraints, it basically means that I'm actually going on the right path, because I'm kind of being able to relate more variables in the two programs. So it's not necessarily more restrictive. I mean, I won't say that. I mean, the intuition here is that we have been able to correlate more stuff. That basically means that we are on, there's likely chance that we're actually going to be able to prove equivalence of the return values eventually. In the other case, we are, we'll probably be in a state where we'll not be able to prove the equivalence of return values because we are missing some correlations there, right? So that's basically the intuition why we want to pick the one that has more restrictions or more relations, I should say. At the same time, I want to say that, look, we have modeled this as a best first search strategy. So even if I make 1 or 2 mistakes here or there, the algorithm is capable of recovering. In fact, sometimes we do have to backtrack because it's a best first search. So if we make one mistake, it's possible to backtrack and then kind of do that. And the algorithms occasionally does have to backtrack. But of course, I mean, we want to kind of minimize backtracking as much as possible, because backtracking is just going to make the problem exponential, I mean, solution exponential time. And the whole value of the solution is that it typically does not even backtrack. And when it backtracks only once or twice at most.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So we have a question from the chat from Jay Aurora. Jay, do you want to ask a question, or should I read it for you? Okay, I'll read it. So you discussed about end-to-end equivalence checking. How useful would the other side of the spectrum be? That is, doing an equivalence check on a more finer level. For example, we could verify each transformation done by the compiler. It can also be, may help us figure out the source of false negatives, or maybe can help us check if the transformation is correct or not.
Okay, that's a great question. And in fact, so by the way, translation validation is a classic problem, and lots of people have worked over it over multiple decades now, maybe 30 years or so. And indeed, most of the work has basically looked at what is called pass-by-pass translation validation. So you look at one pass. So for example, you look at the register allocation pass, or you look at the pass that converts LLVM IR to machine IR, or you look at the common sub-expression elimination, or the global value numbering, or whatever, right? Or you look at the sequence of passes, or you kind of club multiple passes and basically say that, and that's a pass-by-pass translation validation approach. And that obviously seems more tractable, easier problem, and also, as you said, I mean, basically reduces false negatives. So why didn't we do that, and why did we do end-to-end equivalence check? First of all, the motivation of doing end-to-end equivalence check is super optimization for us, and a pass-by-pass translation validator will not work for a super optimizer architecture that we are proposing. So that's basically our key motivation of doing end-to-end equivalence check. Moreover, I would like to say that almost all work that has appeared so far on pass-by-pass translation validation has ignored significant cross sections of the compiler pipeline. For example, if somebody is doing register allocation, they have completely gone, been oblivious of all the loop transformations. Somebody is doing, loop transformations, and they're completely oblivious of all the vectorizing transformations that the code generator is doing, and so on. And so, also inherently, I feel this is, it kind of leaves you with an unsatisfied feeling. I mean, because although you have been able to validate a large part of the compiler pipeline, there's still some part of the compiler pipeline that remains unverified. And so, the guarantees remain weaker. I should point out a related line of work that is very relevant and very related to what we are doing, which is the development of a certified compiler. And this is the CompCert project. In the CompCert project, the compiler is written manually coded proofs at every step. And in some parts of the compiler, basically they use a translation validator. For example, they use a translation validator for the register allocator. So, basically they give end-to-end guarantees, but a large part of those end-to-end guarantees are based on manually written proofs, unlike the automatically generated proofs that we use. They do manual writing of proofs for all their transformations, which is very, very laborious process, and in my opinion, hard to scale to compilers of the order of LLVM and GCC. So it's much smaller and much thinner compiler that they're able to do this for. But the point is that they do use pass-by-pass translation validation for some parts of the compilation pipeline, such as register allocation. And so their translation validation is a very, very useful thing, of course, because it reduces human effort and adds value. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And the first part of the answer is that end-to-end equivalence check is more general in the types of transformations it can, the types of applications it can support, such as super optimization. Also, it gives end-to-end guarantees as opposed to just piecemeal guarantees. So that's why we are basically working on end-to-end, which is a harder problem, but also a more interesting problem, I would imagine.
Hey, nice talk and an excellent presentation and nice work also. So my question is like, yeah, of course, equivalent checking and the soundness of your transformation is very important. But what are your opinion about the performance? Are you considering performance also into the picture?
Performance of
generated code.
Of the generated code. Yeah, of course. I mean, see, the whole point here is that, like aggressive optimizations and then equivalence checking. Okay, I guess you're wondering, like in my architecture, like nowhere do I do, like, is this more performant or not? And of course, I mean, so that's I call it the easier problem, right? Because I mean, you can have some kind of cost function which says, okay, this is a better implementation, or that is a better implementation, and that cost function could have different kind of heuristics to do that, or maybe actual running it and stuff like that. And so the point is that once you get a lot of candidate solutions which are actually validated to the equivalence checker, then you can sort them based on a certain cost function for the given architecture that you want, and then pick the most performant one. So that's basically the idea, although I never explicitly talked about it.
Okay. The another question is for if a practical compiler does a lot of inlining, right? And with this recent link time optimization, you get a whole bunch of files merged into one single control flow graph, and you do the optimization with the aggressive inlining other stuff. So how does your tool, this work practically applies for such kind of, let's say, a spec workload or something? Have you tried have you done any experiments with spec workloads?
Okay. Okay, thank you for that question. That's a very relevant question. And when I say that our work is still ongoing, it's exactly these problems that we are tackling. So I mean, it's almost like what the two things that you have said is exactly the things we are working on. Number one, we want to support inlining, and number two, we want to scale it to the program, scale it to the size of the programs like the spec CPU work, benchmarks and stuff like that. And that's exactly what we are working on. Yeah, still not done. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
So there's another question from Vani. Given your vast experience in compilers, are we seeing a more push towards native code instead of JIT or VM?
Oh, are we seeing more push towards native code as opposed to? I mean, I guess you mean ahead of time compilation versus just in time or interpretation based thing, right? Is AOT more like ahead of time compilation more popular, becoming more popular than JIT? It appears to be that ahead of time compilation has been becoming more popular. For example, if you look at the Android example, there's a lot of ahead of time compiled applications now rather than kind of JIT compiled. And of course, interpretation based is kind of only for the non-performance critical things. So that's of course not going to last very long in my opinion, because see, for a long time, many applications, the computing applications that we had for a long time, they were not performance critical. And also the Moore's law was helping us all along the way. So people were kind of getting away with all these kind of sloppy things, like, just interpret things. By sloppy, I mean performance sloppy. I don't mean like in a derogatory way or anything. Performance sloppy things for a long time. But I definitely think that, because the applications are becoming more and more sophisticated, like AI and stuff, and also the Moore's law is kind of ending. So this sloppiness has to get removed. So obviously, like interpretation and all that will become less and less popular as we go along. When I compare just-in-time versus ahead of time, just-in-time has a huge advantage that you get access to runtime metrics and stuff like that, but it also has a huge disadvantage, which is the complexity. So already the compiler, I think all the complexity that I showed in compilers with GCC and LLVM, that's just for ahead of time compilers. If you add just in time to the mix, it becomes even more complex, right? And you have to worry about a lot of different things now, in a just in time compiler. And in fact, for this reason, the just in time compilers are typically low on optimization, because they don't want to spend that much time during execution, and because of all the complexity and stuff like that. So also for things like which are security critical or mission critical, just in time seems more scary because there's more possibility of bugs because it's more complex. So for those reasons, I would say just-in-time is perhaps decreasing in popularity. I'm not an authority in this, so I won't be able to say one way or the other with full confidence. But I definitely, I would definitely be in the favor of AOT, ahead of time versus just-in-time, based on the current trends. Yes.
Okay, I think Ajit just commented Log4j just happened this week, so RIP JIT.
Yeah, it's like so scary. I don't know. So many engineers have been working overnight to make sure that things are not yeah, things are safe basically. Anyways, one question.
I'm not clued in on this. So what could you elaborate on that?
It was a bug in one of the Java compilers that it would enable remote code execution.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
There were real vulnerabilities, and I think I'm not sure how many companies have got hacked. Okay. That will come out like maybe next few days or weeks. It's a pretty bad one actually.
Oh, thanks for that information, because that corroborates what we were saying. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. One question would be, you mentioned that you're looking for developers, and we have audience here. What is the best way to reach out to you if anyone is more interested?
Absolutely. Please send me an email. Saurav@compiler.ai. We are very keen to kind of get compiler people on board, and I think we are doing some very exciting work. So would love to have I would love to have a conversation if any folks in this room are kind of interested in having a conversation.
Sort of, do you also take people for internships, students?
Yes, we do. Yes,
Okay.
we do. Yeah.
So I have a question adding to Jay Arora's pass by pass verification for each transformation. So so let's say we construct at the start of the pass pipeline, we construct these product these CFGs, and every transformation is going to work in a subset of the CFG, right? It's going to mutate only the subset of the CFG. Why can't we just do equivalence checking on a subset of that, instead of going through the whole thing?
Could you please repeat your question so that I understand it properly before I start answering it?
So you compare these equivalence checking between before and after the transformation, right? For a pass by pass transformation, and pass just mutates only a subset of the CFG, right? So is it possible to restrict equivalence checking only to a subset of the CFG instead of looking at the whole one?
Yeah, I mean, so okay, that's okay. I understand the question. I think you are saying that, okay, why do I need to do the whole CFG? Maybe I can restrict to a subset of a CFG.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very valid. So in fact, when we structure this algorithm, this super optimizer based compiler design algorithm, we're basically saying that it's a peephole optimizer, which means we're going to have a sliding window, and we're going to basically look at every window that we get, every peephole that we get, and basically query and see whether we are able to find an optimization for that in a table, in a cache table or something like that. And so that way we basically kind of divide the problem, divide the whole complexity of the entire program to smaller things. So we are already kind of trying to provision for that in the optimizer. But in the equivalence checker, also we can potentially do that. So far we haven't done that. As I said, equivalence checker has two important applications for us. One is translation validation, and the other is super optimization. So far we have been just looking at the translation validation setting. And the translation validation setting, we have to basically look at end to end. But you are absolutely right in pointing out that when we look at it in the super optimization setting, then we may want to kind of just look at some sections of the CFG. And basically say, okay, look at this section, and can I find an equivalent which is faster here, and things like that, and then send it to the equivalence checker and things like that. So yeah, that's a possibility we haven't explored so far. But we've been just doing end-to-end and full CFG because we've been working in the translation validation setting to make our equivalence checker more robust before we can try all these fancier things.
Okay, thank you.
Are you able to model multi-threaded or asynchronous execution in this?
Okay, are we able to model asynchronous or multi-threaded execution? So far, we haven't done any effort, made any effort in that direction. Yes, but yeah. So far, we haven't made any effort in that direction. Maybe a good place to start there would be to kind of support C++, C11 atomics and that kind of thing, right? So yeah, but we haven't made any efforts yet. Yeah.
Thanks.
Professor, I have a question. Would it help to start with a more type-safe language, like compared to C? We can start with like LLVM IR or Rust, because you'll have less like uncertainties to explore.
In the context of multi-threaded, or
even like in a simple program itself?
Yeah, see, basically the reason we pick C instead of other languages is because the optimizers for C are by far the most sophisticated optimizers, right? I mean, and so even in the research world, if it kind of helps to say that we are able to optimize, check equivalence across this very aggressive optimization pipeline for the C programming language. If we, for example, do it for Java or something like that, then the optimization pipeline is not that aggressive yet. And so the target is easier, and so we would get criticism on that front. So the only reason we have picked C is because it's, from a compiler optimization standpoint, it's the most important target, or most relevant target, I should say. Yeah.
Okay. Like if we compare like C to LLVM IR, like LLVM IR supposedly is more type safe. There is a already an equivalence like from C to LLVM IR. So you'd get, I think you'd get like same advantage as well as type safety. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, that's so when you say LLVM is more type safe, right? It's a little bit like, I mean, it's an incomplete statement. So by the way, LLVM is more feature rich than C. I mean, it has support for vector instructions and things like that, right? It also has more types, as you said, absolutely. And notice that, so one thing that we are actually pursuing is basically LLVM to LLVM translation validation, which is also an important thing in itself because LLVM has become so popular, because that has its own challenges with respect to all the different kinds of constructs that LLVM supports, especially with respect to undefined behavior, such as poison values, and undefined values and so on. And the problem becomes really interesting in that setting as well. Although that's a purely translation validation setting in the context of a particular compiler, which is LLVM. But it's definitely a very interesting problem, and we have been looking at it in parallel. But it's not like, I mean, it won't help us in our kind of other goals or other applications, such as debug headers or such as super optimization and things like that. Just want to say that.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
So I have a question. So what are the implementation problems that you faced in developing the super optimizers and equivalence checkers?
Yeah, so I mean, so this has been a very long development effort, I would say. First of all, it started when I was doing my PhD, and we kind of did a lot of encoding of. So some of the important things was, how do you do a disassembly of the assembly code, x86 assembly code, which is already very hard, bring it into a form such that we can convert it into logical circuits, which can be kind of used by the equivalence checker and the super optimizer. Those were really hard parts, actually, from the implementation standpoint. And of course, there were kind of a lot of kind of assembly level handling that was pretty difficult in the beginning. After that, I would say the whole, like, doing the equivalence checking and all that was, getting started. I mean, getting the first equivalence checker running, it took us like more than 5-6 years maybe, because it was a really, a lot of things had to be fixed to be able to basically start reasoning about programs of a reasonable size, which have loops and things like that. Both at the assembly level and at the IR level. In fact, our initial efforts at equivalence checking were assembly to assembly. So we would compare O0 code against O2 code for equivalence, both assembly, right? And after spending many years on that, we realized that this is actually not a good idea, because we lose much information in O0, because a lot of information such as high level types or aliasing information is lost in the O0. And so, then we moved to LLVM IR, and that was a great decision because LLVM IR is much easier to work with, and so on the source side. By LLVM IR, we kind of use the LLVM IR to do the C program specification. I should clarify, because we don't use the whole feature of LLVM like undef and poison values, but we do use LLVM IR to model the C program semantics, for example. And so that has been easier. More recently, after we were able to get our first equivalence checker working and then kind of migrated to LLVM, the most important challenge that we have been facing is scalability. Okay, and inlining and everything. Basically, we just bottlenecked by how big programs we can handle, and we have been working on that for a long time now, and we hope we'll be able to make progress in the coming few years on that front. So yeah, that's ongoing work.